Okay, here we go.
Hello, everyone.
Hetman has not died yet, but we shall endeavor to get there before the evening's done. How
Yes,
are
getting
we?
over a pretty nasty bacterial infection, but yeah, I should make it through this.
That's why we don't talk to people in real life. All right. So, what this is our contribution to election year. Probably sometimes can be more topical than others, but what we're going to do is start going through some of our early American political history and talking about it, which should be fun and fascinating. People love to argue about American political history and what they think the founders intended. Well, I'm here to tell you what they intended because they wrote it the fuck down. um,
And I'm here mostly to listen and provide a little bit of an opinion, definitely not an expert one, because American history is certainly something that I really don't have a great grasp on. But it's something that I think that I will enjoy, and I hope all of you will as well.
yeah, that country America seems to be sticking around a little bit, much to the
Yep,
consternation of certain folks. Yeah,
quite a few nations.
I think it's worth talking about because we're going to spend a lot of this year being told what we think the founders intended. Uh, and to be perfectly frank, they'd be going electric car charging spaces. What sorcery is this? So, like, we need to talk about what kind of thoughts animated the founders, and we have some opportunities to do that here. So, it's a wonderful piece of high school trivia for your civics classes, but prior to the United States Constitution being written down, the United States is governed by the Articles of Confederation. And the story goes that they wrote the Articles after the Revolutionary War. Um, and these governed the country up until they decided something better was needed. And then they talk about why they decided something better was needed. But I think it's worth looking at the articles because they kind of paint a picture of what people thought early America was going to look like.
What was interesting for me actually doing a little bit of research on it, because of course, I learned about the articles in, you know, my honors American history class in high school. I learned, I think maybe when I had a American History 101 or something. Actually, no, I took the American history classes that I took in undergrad were mostly like modern American history. So really starting
It would have
after the
been
Civil War.
maybe a week or two at the beginning of the lecture of the first session of the first
Yeah,
iteration of American history. They don't spend a lot of time on it.
no, and I don't think people really, it's not really that well known. Um, the one thing that I want to ask, and I think this is you know, was Shays Rebellion a result of the ineffectiveness of this?
Well,
I
that's an
think we're
interesting.
maybe.
Yeah, I kind of intended Shays Rebellion to be next session, but maybe we talk about it now to kind of bring this all together. So maybe the first place to start is why the articles exist. Uh so if people think back to their American history courses, you'll remember that the decision to leave Great Britain and become their own independent nation was not an immediate or unanimous one for the colonies. Even after the fighting had started, no one was quite sure what the objective of all 13 colonies was for some time. There was a lot of political wrangling that went on behind the scenes, and eventually you get to July 1776, and we write Thomas Jefferson and etc. writes the Declaration of Independence, and we announce our intention to no longer be governed by England. Basically, immediately after this, a new question comes up for the Continental Congress. if we're not English subjects, then how are we governed, right? So for nigh on a year and a half, give or take, the Second Continental Congress debates, and I think it's November of 1777. They draft the Articles of Confederation, uh, which is the government that they use throughout the War for Independence. And after its conclusion, it's the government they ratify to be the United States central government.
Can you explain to me? So, it's been a long time since you know, I can't even remember actually the last time I read about the Revolutionary War or had any sort of exposure. But the Continental Army, was that a unified army led by George Washington with people from all the constituent colonies, or did each one of the colonies, whichever fronts that were in this war, were they basically their own militias fighting against the British? I don't really understand it too well.
This is a topic in unto itself, but it kind of folds in here. So the Continental Army is a unified national army, but its constituent pieces come from the states. The
Hmm.
first thing that I think to point out is that the Continental Congress has a consistent problem throughout the War for Independence, coming up with money to pay the army, to supply it, to equip it. They are operating basically on the goodwill of France, who just wants to dick over Great Britain. The Continental Army, in and of itself, there's a very popular myth about the American War for Independence, where you just have British soldiers in their bright red jackets marching in perfect file and getting shot at from the trees, speaking American. This I don't want to say it didn't happen, but it's not a wide scale thing. It happens in the South, where the war is very different. But for the vast majority of the war, it is the Americans are assembling for themselves a European style army. They have enlistments. They have troops to keep in bay. They have militiamen that they want to make regular. They have food problems, all of these things. And they have to learn to march and fight and do all these things that they never had to do before. So, especially if you get involved in the United States Army, um, what they'll do is they'll teach you about some of the figures who are pivotal to that that process. So a big one, at least for Illinois students, is Casimir Pulaski, right?
Of
Everyone
course, yeah.
has heard of Casimir Pulaski in Illinois, and outside of Illinois, not a soul has heard of him. Uh, so Casimir Pulaski is a general from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Hi, Lucy, we hear you out there. General from the
Shout out
Polish-Lithuanian
to Lucy.
Commonwealth who comes to the United States after leading his country's armed forces against both the Prussians and the Russians successfully. And he starts putting together America's cavalry forces. Another one is a Prussian general by the name of von Steuben, who helps America drill its infantry. And then you have Lafayette, who's famously one of Washington's closest confidants and advisors on his staff. So you have a lot of this European expertise coming to help build a regular trained army, right? And you have this like if you read the campaigns that Washington puts this army through, and the war lasts quite some time from 1775 into 1780. So it's a long war. Every winter, the army is on the verge of falling apart because they don't have the sinews within the Continental Congress to supply the army or to pay it. So like that is an artifact of the Articles of Confederation. The basic structure of the Articles is that it sets up a Congress, the Continental Congress. The Congress is called the Continental Congress in American history up until the point where the Constitution takes over, actually. And you have this Congress, and they have the ability to say, I want to do X. But whatever X might happen to be, and they have a list of enumerated powers, you have to get state approval to do so. and the states most pivotally have control of the purse strings. So it makes it very difficult to, for example, come up with money to raise an army unless everyone recognizes the threat.
In reading, and preparing for um, this episode, the one thing that I learned actually what was a big problem after the Revolutionary War was paying veterans.
Yes.
Actually,
So the Continental Army was promised a retirement pension. It was fairly generous by the Continental Congress. It was basically never paid. Um, which is why you end up seeing people like Henry Knox and George Washington, like famous Continental Army veterans, who are very strong advocates for national government in this form of a constitution throughout the 1780s. They are looking for some way to make good on the promises of Congress. Uh, and that's a problem because Congress has virtually no power. They don't have basic powers like compelling a state's delegation to show up to Congress. So, like, a fairly frustrating fact for most Americans in the early part of American history, at least till up to the ratification of the Constitution, is that Congress can't get a quorum to do business because no one feels obliged to show up. It, it's it is all of the bureaucracy you can want without any of the efficacy of bureaucracy. There's nothing that it generates that has the force of law.
I'm reading a lot about like all the small little insurrections and rebellions that happened after the Revolutionary War, and overwhelmingly, um, they had to do with taxes and not people not getting paid their dues. Um, there's so much mythology, around. I mean, I remember it just being in school, like the just the stuff that they the cartoons they showed us, the textbooks we use. There's so much mythology around this period, but the reality of it is so it's not a really as glorious of a history
Well,
as
I think anyone looking at their country's history probably comes to that conclusion eventually.
of course, yeah. I mean that's not a feature that's common just to the United States history, but I mean I'm amazed at the degree, to which one, like, for example, the degree to which France was pivotal in the victory of the colonies in the Revolutionary War. Um and really actually how close things got later on. I mean, this is way later with the War of 1812 to falling apart again.
There is a connection. So, like, those two items are kind of semi-related. Uh, Americans have traditionally, and the British too, up to a point, less so by this period. Americans took on a attitude of shunning the concept of a standing military. So, what you have, like you were asking about how the Continental Army is put together, you have a lot of people who are drilling on their own time in militias uh, as citizens of X, Y, and Z state who come together and form an army. But, like, the trouble that you're going to find, and it's not an unusual trouble to this day either, is like it's hard to weld those things together without a professional officer corps and NCOs and all these things studded out throughout. So like that makes it much more difficult to build an army. But like that, the articles problem is that no one wants to pay the army. So like it had the The principal thing to note is that the Continental Congress, the Confederate Congress, can call up an army in times of national need. Hey, Charlie. Hey, Pound Dead. Who can call up an army in national need, but they don't have the power to have the states man it. And the states have a considerable amount of power over who is in this force because they can name anyone ranked colonel and below as officers. The the Navy is an even more sorry state at this point. Uh, but like this kind of comes out. This has a lot of knockdown effects. The first effect is Congress can't can't do foreign policy, right? Because they have to have a quorum and they can't get a quorum to ratify treaties. So the primary thing in which Congress might have power to do, which is address national issues to other countries, they don't because no one's there to vote on it. So, for example, the treaty that ends the War for Independence, the Treaty of Paris, the United Kingdom is not feeling any rush to ever like fulfill its half of the terms. Like they stay in American border forts for well after the Constitution is ratified, and we have enough of a actual government to kick them out. This has another knockdown effect for economics too, and let's talk about this. Let's do Shays Rebellion today.
When you talk about border forts, you're talking about forts that were in even the territories, for example, that were not.
This would mostly be
Yet.
Ohio a territory at this point. Some of it's been settled.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
This is frontier forts to protect against attacks by indigenous populations.
You know what's one thing too, and I don't want to divert, but I mean this is something probably you don't know. What was the overall population? I mean, like settler population in North America in this time. I would imagine
I
not.
know at the outset of the War for Independence, it's something on the order of 3 million.
Which is actually that's surprisingly high.
Well, you're taking 13 colonies and a not insane amount of support.
That's true.
Yeah, Charlie, the American Navy is actually owned by the states at this point. So each 11, I think it's like 11 or 10 of the individual states have standing navies and like share some things between them. Less than 10,000 in the frontier, maybe, but we're talking about the colonies overall. The colonies slash states.
So on the western frontier, that would be like.
Yeah, there's not a lot of people out there.
Fort Dearborn and like Illinois territory. Ohio, geez.
Some of that, yeah. Some of that's kind of yeah. Chicago is like some of it. Like there's not a lot of people out here. Fur trappers mostly. Some big farming hasn't started yet. A lot of it's fur trappers. The other thing to note is the South is a very different thing too. Like we have a picture of the antebellum South being king cotton, and that doesn't come into play now here because the cotton gin hasn't been invented yet. Cotton is still very, very taxing to grow and process and make into textiles. The Industrial Revolution is only just kicking off. It's not quite there yet. The cotton gin isn't quite there yet. So the population of the South is very small. Principally, it's not even that large for enslaved populations, except in Virginia, which has a different climate. So like they're growing different things. They're growing a lot of rice. They're growing a lot of tobacco. Those are the cash crops of the South. And the South is where you see those much more brutal guerrilla fighting, where you do see the guys ducking in and out of trees, and this prompts a response from the Red Army where they burn towns, or excuse me, the British Army where they burn towns, etc., etc. There's a lot of interesting battlefields that happen in the South Revolutionary War.
So there is some bits of truth with that movie, The Patriot, for example, the Mel Gibson movie. There were some reprisal to guerrilla actions like that.
There was. the Patriot is unfair in a lot of ways to the British. Uh,
Yeah, that's
Colonel
I would
Cavington
imagine that.
was not nearly as much of a jackass as he's portrayed in the Patriot, for instance. It's there is quite a lot of it, but there's not. It's not like it's not a widespread thing the way it's depicted sometimes, like the entire course of that. The thing is, in like you're talking about 18th century armies, they mostly move as coherent groups. The corps system hasn't been invented by Napoleon yet. You don't see armies splitting up and fanning out. So they have the cavalry, and the cavalry patrols around. You got infantry. Uh, you got infantry. So, like, say you and 10 of your buddies show up with muskets to pop off some rounds at marching redcoats walking by. First of all, after you pop off those rounds, 100 redcoats are going to turn and fire into the woods where you just were at. Second, your range at best is maybe 150 meters, but probably closer to 100. It's not going to take that long for a guy on horseback to ride you down. So like when you have these guerrilla actions that they talk about, it's a lot of it's interactions between Native American warriors and whatever side they have taken, and various small elements moving around the countryside of patriots or loyalists, and there's a lot of brutality that goes back and forth because there is a second component to the War of Independence in that it was often a civil war as well.
That's how I was just about to bring that up. It actually reminds me a lot of the Kansas and Missouri theater of the Civil War.
I think Bleeding Kansas is a good way to look at part of the South, at least in terms
Yeah,
of how it how it shakes out, and that we'll talk about later on when we get to the Civil War, um, or we get to the period before the Civil War, because I could talk myself stupid about 1820 to 1860. The the other part of like this, like let's kind of reel back into Shays Rebellion because I think that's really illustrative of all of the weaknesses down the line of the articles here. The first thing to understand is a Shays Rebellion happens in Massachusetts, principally, and the story that kind of gets told is that a number of tenant farmers take to arming themselves to uh, stop their farms from being foreclosed upon by rich landowners in Boston and whatnot. The actual story is way more interesting. So the first thing to understand is each of these states, you have 13 states now, is that they all basically run their own affairs under the articles, and they don't much care for the interference of the larger Congress. The idea of of um, of the articles is that they have a Congress that can deal with outside influence like Great Britain. The reality of this is that they don't. So the first link in this particular chain is those farmers and those sharecroppers. And they're sitting on land that they need to farm to make money. Sometimes they don't make money, or money's short, or something bad happens. It's farming. Uh, you have to roll with the punches, right? So the farmers start working off of a system of credit with their suppliers. These suppliers can grant them credit because they have a certain amount of liquid capital. And they in turn get supplied by people further up the chain. Basically, the urban centers are supplying the farming rural areas. So something that goes wrong in the urban center economically affects the farmers eventually. So long as they can get credit, they're probably okay. The What happens though is something happens in Boston, and that has a ripple effect on the line. People uh, in traders in the United Kingdom that want to trade with people in Boston don't necessarily trust that the system is stable. They don't think their debts can be repaid if something happens, if someone goes under. So they don't issue credit to their suppliers and their merchants in Boston, who in turn can't be as cash liquid as they were able to be before with anyone who owes them money. So what happens is uh, Daniel Shea is his involvement is somewhat disputed by him. A bunch of farmers get together after a series of horrible foreclosures that rob them of their land, and they go to
Mm-hmm.
stop the courts from foreclosing, and they bring muskets. This is obviously horrific for the people who's are being rebelled against. The first effort of it is basically it's the rich, um, who are basically being told we're not going to get our property back. They don't much care. And this is 1787, so they've been at this for a while. These are a lot of Continental Army veterans. They do try to turn around and overthrow the government of Massachusetts. Uh this is alarming for a lot of people up and down the coast. Americans like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, etc. The Congress immediately says we're going to put down this rebellion. Unfortunately, it wasn't alarming enough to get the states to give them money to raise an army. So Massachusetts is forced to put this rebellion down on its own. However, all the people who are normally in the militia are currently sitting outside of the courthouses with muskets.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a shortage of people, so they have to bring in more people and pay them and do all these things, and they run out of money. The state government of Massachusetts runs out of money. Ultimately, the rebellion is put down, people are dispersed and sent away, and etc., because the rich people in Boston paid for a private militia to help the state put it down, put the rebellion down.
It
All
lasted over a year, though.
Yes, this took some time, and it's cited as, and it is one of the principal reasons why people get together to amend the Articles of Confederation and ultimately chuck them out for the Constitution.
I wanted to, getting back to militias, um, the reason why they were set up in the first place, right, is to fend off, you know, to essentially fight against the native indigenous people of the United States.
Yes, kind of. There's a lot that goes into that. Uh, the colonies have an iffy record of defending themselves throughout their early history before the Seven Years' War, which we call the French and Indian War here in the United States. So, for example, a big one that gets cited a lot, Attaché Films does some great stuff on this, about King Philip's War,
Hmm.
which is a conflict between Massachusetts Bay and New England colonies and the local indigenous American tribes. The indigenous Americans tear the crap out of the colonists because they don't know how to fight. They don't know how to build armies. They don't know how to operate muskets. They have to be taught all these things, and they're very bad at not getting caught in bad terrain. So the ultimate aim of these, like the efficacy of a colonial militia depends very heavily on where they are, who's running it, and that's not dissimilar from most armies in the Europe at the time. Like officers don't. We have a professional officer education system now, so they go to school and blah 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 and become officers. You largely, if you're a man of a certain standing in the 18th century, and you have enough money to afford a commission, you buy your commission and you start organizing on the ground, and basically armies kind of grow up by who can afford to be in the army. Uh, and there's a kind of there's a patchwork system for when countries need armies where they take a local force and integrate it into their standing army, and then they get rid of it when they're done because it's expensive and they don't want to pay for it. That is how America does things for a not insignificant portion of its history.
I mean, after the Second World War too, even
It's a
as
different
far as that.
ball game then. Like
Yeah.
even up to the Civil War, you have this bifurcation of states' units being integrated into the army as necessary and then returned to the states. Um, there is a no one really wants to pay for a standing army for any length of time. Americans don't have taxes in any real sense until the Civil War.
Yeah.
So you're depending on tariffs to fund all the country's functions, and you don't pay for what you don't need, and you don't, and because armies aren't that complicated, at least compared to today, they don't have to pay for it. Um, and yeah, I think it's probably worth pointing out that the Articles of Confederation are principally powered around national needs provided for by sovereign states and what they're willing to pay for. And it's very difficult to get someone in Georgia to care about someone in Massachusetts, and etc. Particularly if there's no pressing threat. Even during the War for Independence, it was hard to get everyone on board. Southern states were under the impression that they weren't going to have to fight when the fighting starts in Boston and New York. So that's kind of it's a patchwork system, and uh, that's what makes it difficult. And it I kind of sat on my notes for a little while, and I have like wartime government circled, because it was a system built in war out of what they thought we would tolerate as a country, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and it didn't stand up to the light of peace, which I think is a fair point. Yes, Charlie, the Southern elites were very afraid of slave rebellions. In fact, in the discussion about ratifying the Constitution, at least in some cases, directly referenced Shays' Rebellion as an influence to ratify. Um, the mechanics of a slave uprising were probably never really there for a mass uprising in the South. There's a lot of factors that go into that. But the fear was very real.
Okay. I'm just asking if I understand it right. The Confederation, or the Articles of Confederation, negatively affected the Continental Army during the war and after.
Insofar as the Continental Army existed after, yes, the Continental Army is disbanded. So, like, what happens is you get a lot of veterans riots, really, about getting paid. I think it was like 1783. George Washington had to convince people to not lynch Congress. Tried to convince American veterans not to lynch Congress, and the situation got so bad they had to leave Philadelphia.
Oh my gosh.
So I wonder why. Because some historians want to. Well, let's bring that up, Charlie. That's a good question. Why do some people dispute Shays' Rebellion's influence on the Constitutional Convention? The answer is what we're talking about now in the Articles of Confederation. Some aspects of it have been carried forth into the American mythos. The concept of the state as a sovereign power, especially. Uh, and it's not like that initially, right? So we'll talk about this a little more when we talk about ratifying the Constitution. But it's not like that initially. Like initially, everyone understands. It's very implicit to the Anti-Federalists that they get that they are giving up this power that they had under the Articles of Confederation, and they bring this up as a caution. Like if we do this, it's permanent. We are no longer countries. We are sovereign, bound to this one nation state. Uh, uh, 1812 happens, 1815, blah, 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 and you get into the tail end of 1819. And South Carolina has a problem with one of the tariffs issued by the federal government. It's called the Tariff of Abominations by South Carolinians at that time. They are a very melodramatic bunch in South Carolina. So Andrew Jackson is president at this point, and his vice president is Calhoun. His name is escaping me. And the thing to recall at this point is that vice presidents and presidents do not run on the same ticket together at this time. They are elected from first and second place.
That is something I didn't know.
So John C. Calhoun, that's his name. I remembered it. Ha ha ha. John C. Calhoun is opposed to Andrew Jackson, but only just because he's kind of one of American history's first big, giant political dicks. He proposes that should South Carolina be forced to undertake this tariff, South Carolina should cede. And that's kind of where this concept of a state as a independent Jeffersonian republic really reasserts itself. A collection of republics for the nation. Thank you, 1828. I apologize. This is like a very pivotal moment for much of American history rolling forward, because it kind of undoes the understanding that is built around the Constitution. And it's where a lot of the myth of like you hear it today, I hear it still today, where people try to argue for these immense powers granted to the states. Neo-Confederates love to do it. They love to argue that secession is a power that they have, only if you can get away with it, not legally. So it's one of those it's one of those things that's very like,
you don't really have that whole, yeah, it's really after the Civil War that you kind of have the idea of like, we as sort of one country versus we as, constituent states.
well, to a certain extent, it makes a lot of sense on one level to identify with your state, right?
At that time, for sure.
Because that's something like you have a lot more granular power to interact with your representatives on a state level than you might necessarily do to someone in Philadelphia or Washington. So you're undergoing quite a lot. And like the tenor of American campaigning is different at that point. How we elect people is different. It's not like it's a very different than what we do today. Elections, for example, we didn't directly vote for senators. In the original Constitution, we voted for representatives and electors for president. The you're running way ahead of me, Charlie. Like at least 6 decades ahead of me here. We're gonna get to it, I promise. The the idea here in the Articles of Confederation and replacing it is, how do we do something that works on two levels? The first is a government that can make the states comply for the good of the nation. This is a somewhat controversial point of fact. Even today, we argue about what limits federal power has versus state power. The second point is, and this is I think probably better realized and not as well thought out. Uh, Not as well thought out is how states can present a united front to the rest of the world, because it becomes very possible in a case of a situation like the Confederate Congress has, where Great Britain can just play different states off each other for trade. And they did have a lot of problems, where they did have a lot of internal problems where they were unable to come to an agreement about internal tariffs, which is why one of the things the Constitution does is set out regulations for interstate commerce belonging to the federal government. Um, that was another one of the trades rebellions cited a lot in history books, but another one is those disputes over interstate commerce, which is of particular interest to a lot of the framers of the Constitution and the founding fathers, because a lot of them are businessmen. who are moving land and goods around the colonies. Well, not necessarily land, but ownership of land. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
So, like, they are immensely interested in making that an easy process. We're going to get so far away from my notes in this series. Jesus Christ. Sorry. I'm just looking at my stuff and going, damn it. Uh,
It's there. I mean, there's a lot to
there's a lot to get through.
unpack here. Yeah.
So, the other thing I promised is we're going to talk about why this is relevant to you walking into a polling place. Um, and on a certain level, it isn't, because obviously the Articles of Confederation stopped being a thing in 1789. Uh, but it's not, because people believe some of these tenets still apply today. And so it becomes possible to get your vote by appealing to it. I think we've all heard from some form or another the limited
Yeah.
government
That's
people,
what I was just gonna. That's what I was just gonna mention.
and a not insignificant part of their ethos is rooted in their understanding of this document and how it was designed. They don't see the flaws, or they don't, because we don't talk about the flaws that are most pertinent to them. So, like
The
Shays Rebellion, like, oh, whiny farmers want their land back, and not rich businessmen that can't get credit. Things like that.
that still resonates a lot today. I mean, look at sort of the dispute with ranchers in the it's, is that like the Pacific Northwest, Idaho, the Clive and
That's
Bundy movement?
that's actually
Like,
closer to me out here in Colorado, Texas, New Mexico area.
yeah, I was just
The
gonna
Bureau
say
of
that's
Land Management and ranching fees. That's a long ass story, man.
it's a lot, but I mean, doesn't that this have some relevance
It does. Uh, the Bundys are, well, they're insane. First of all,
that I know, but
yeah, their particular takeover of the wildlife refuge was in Oregon, but their ranch that they tried to fortify was down here, wasn't it? Uh,
I remember that when was it? Like a few years ago. No, it was more than a few now, maybe like 7 or 8 years ago. They actually a bunch of them and a bunch of their supporters armed actually drove out some federal law enforcement.
there was a standoff outside a ranch, uh,
Yeah,
that I recall. So there is a degree to which the states are empowered to make their own laws. There is a limit to that too, however. States' rights are not unlimited. States don't have the right to conduct foreign policy, for example. So recently in the news, Texas is trying to do its own immigration policy, and that's a no-no, not constitutional. Um, Understanding that limit and understanding why that limit exists is what we want to take away from this. We especially a lot of our viewers coming from where we come from are leftists, and they are very critical of systems and want to tear them down. And I understand this impetus, because a lot of systems have a lot of really shitty aspects to them. But there is a somewhat bit in logic called Chesterton's fence. And what Chesterton's fence posits is that you come up across the road and you see a fence blocking the road. And this seems very silly to you, and you want to take it down. So you look to the person next to it, the property next to it, and you go, well, I'd like to take down this fence that's blocking the road. And the guy goes, well, I can't let you do that because we don't know why that fence was put there. So even if something looks stupid, looks difficult, looks hard, what our lesson to do, and what we need to encourage people who are running for office to do, is to look past rhetoric and take a good long look at why this thing exists, what it's there to do. so that they're not removing, like the fence was put there for a reason. So we need to understand the reason and then make sure the reason is no longer valid before we remove the fence.
Yeah, not to jump ahead
And like we
of
have to take
ourselves.
those tools to do that. We have to take those time to look at those things. A I have entertained myself uh, when I've been getting ready to go to sleep by rewatching um, Last Man Standing, that Tim Allen comedy from a couple years back. Still horrible, by the way. But what happened was someone said, "Yeah, this show is getting taken off the air because it's conservative," and then I went and watched it, and I discovered that the show was being taken off the air because it was a bland vanilla comedy, and it lasted much longer than it should have. Anyway, there is a lot made of that show's political commentary, and it's all surface level and all. No one's asking why the fence is in the road; they're just complaining about the fence. That's kind of the lesson to take away from this. Um, and that's why we need to keep history in schools too. The retreat of history from public universities and the even more like dumbing down of history to its least offensive components to conservatives in grade school is going to create a voting public that is incapable of figuring out why they keep tripping over the fence, let alone trying to remove it. We so like we see what a weak central government can do, and the short answer is nothing. They just sit there and dilly dally half the time and say we'd like to do X, but then no one lets them do X.
I was just gonna say, like, what I took from learning about the Articles of Confederation is that you know it really, really is a weak central government.
Yeah, there is a balance. You see it particularly in this period as you look at different countries and how they are constructing governments. The United States is one example of a radically different solution than the United Kingdom. How are they defining the powers of the executive? All of these things and what these positions are. And like Charlie, you're absolutely right. There are portions of the Constitution that are stupendously vague, that are elucidated on by law. Um, and there is a certain degree to which the Constitution or the Articles are supposed to be vague. You want your overarching skeleton for government to not constrain you in terms of what is going to happen in the future. Because I think a great example of this is the Second Amendment and people's insistence on that. Had the founding fathers learned about 30 round magazines, they would have been somewhat more hesitant to just leave those laying around for anyone to carry.
Or they'd be like, "Oh damn, if we had some of those, we could have
Faster,
um
manifest destiny.
we faster manifest destiny, um manifest destiny all the way, you know, through the whole Western Hemisphere."
So yes, and like I think one of the bigger periods in American history to talk about politically, especially because is that period around 1890 to 1910. A lot of things changed that just dramatically changed the world, and we have to change with it. Like I talk about at the beginning of here how the colonies all like had their own navies. Doesn't work in a modern era when you need purpose built warships. It barely worked when they did it, when you still needed purpose built warships. Things like that. Understanding why the passage of time. I'm going to go get our sheet again, the what you call it, the five C's of history. Understanding why change over time renders certain things invalid is, I think, really important, um, especially especially in the context of talking about who we're voting for, why we're voting for them, and what they want to do. We in America, we reach to the past, especially, and a lot of countries do this. It's not unique to America. We reach to the past to validate what we're doing in the present, um, which is not necessarily always a good idea.
No, it's not. in so many levels, it's not a good idea. But it's something that's done all the time.
Yeah, I think the Articles of Confederation are only openly embraced by the most weirdo of hardcore conservatives at this point. Um, there are a lot of
Could
people.
one state that the articles are sort of like the libertarians' wet dream?
Yes and no. Like a watered down version of the Articles. Like most libertarians don't have a very solid understanding of American history to begin with. So like they get really on board with the states' rights part, but only insofar as they think that it'll make it possible for them to put their will over the state more readily. Libertarians ultimately don't want anyone to be in charge unless that person is them, and they will embrace any kind of chicanery to get there.
So you think that we've covered this?
I think we have hit most of the major points. I oh,
I'm looking at Charlie right now. It's why 48% of my generation doesn't know what the Holocaust is. Made it too flowery to the point of it not being worth it.
well, yeah, it's difficult to do. Like I've kind of sat on this for a little while. Running this channel is going to be a real challenge if we want to make it functional as a business, because ad revenue is going to be few and far between. Uh, for example, on Monday I had a discussion with Fairy Queen about women in the military, and I had fully intended to be as oblique as possible about the issue of sexual violence. But she just comes out and says it, like, well, screw it. I'm going to come out and say it too. So we said things that will surely get the stream demonetized if we're ever monetized. Uh, History is hard to talk about because
It's
no
hard
one,
to it's you can't sugarcoat history, and
you,
actually,
you
even when
can't
you're talking
do that.
about
But to
I,
get people to buy it is a different, and to make advertisers buy it is a different story.
I was just gonna state too, I mean, talking about that particular issue, ongoing issue in the military, in the US military, I mean, that's not even talking about history per se, is it's talking about a current problem.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
yeah.
It's a good talk I had with Fairy Queen. Everyone, you should go watch it. It's back on Monday. Um, so yeah, that's kind of this is going to be the format of this. It's half me lecturing, but trying not to sound like I'm lecturing. So I apologize.
Forgive me too, I'm not feeling my best. And admittedly, I haven't prepared a whole lot for this episode. I planned on doing a lot more with the coming with our coming episodes. American history is very, I wouldn't say that like it's a weak spot. I wouldn't say that it's, I find all of American history boring per se, but it's nowhere near as much of my forte as it is Daedalus's forte.
So here's what we're going to do now that we've skipped ahead. I don't have to come up with a whole hour and a half on Shay's Rebellion now. I can just sit and talk about the Constitutional Convention until Hetman's ears fall off. Next, in 2 weeks' time, that's what we're going to start the Constitutional Convention. Why it happened, what happened during it. It's going to be fun. Except,
I'm just waiting. I'm really just waiting until we get to the Civil War so I have something that I enjoy to talk about.
we're going to make
We
the
can
Constitutional Convention fun because we're going to lay the groundwork for the Civil War by kicking the can down the curb. In the meantime,
can,
what
can we do a brief mention about the Mormon War?
we can, but we have to get there because that's 1850s. Yeah,
It is
yeah.
the 1850s, yeah.
Okay, I remember that off the top of my head. I'm doing good. Um, let's be perfectly frank. Uh, what's coming up on Friday? We should be having a sedate, calm, panel discussion with a number of people who are more or less amateur professionals in the realm of defense commentary on the war in Ukraine. We'll be talking about the past year, what happened, what went wrong, and what we hope for the coming year. It should be a good time.
Definitely join us for that one. I'm looking forward to it.
If I summon some energy, not tomorrow because I'm busy, we'll do Antietam for our Civil War Ultimate General playthrough. Um, I have been getting people quietly bugbearing me about Warhammer content, uh, which I'll figure out as I go. Um, yes, I hear all of you about it. Um, Other things happening is Warhammer Fantasy is being released, and I am going to do that like hell, because I complained bitterly about it being obliterated back last decade. So it's about time. Avery, dog is definitely wants my attention. Uh, so head on over to the Discord, and let's start sharing models and make people paint. It'll be fun. The other thing is, we hit 400 subscribers. Yay!
Yay! And we got to do something for that.
So we're gonna find something for me to kick Hetman's ass at.
Can we pick something? Can we pick something that like I'm good at? Like
I don't know. Are you good
let
at
me think.
anything?
That
was a joke. Sorry.
I know that is the joke, but I actually had sort of an existential, not an existential crisis, but I realized that one of the only things I'm good at is
That was a quick existential crisis.
it's
I pondered all of
historical
existence.
research.
I pondered all of existence and found myself lacking for all of 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll find something. We'll do that. The other point is we want to get to 500. It'll be nice, and then you can give me money for super chats. It'll be cute, cool. We'll set up a dog cam, a certain amount of super chats, and Avery will do a trick. Actually, he won't do a trick. He'll just bother me. But that's beside the point. So tell your friends.
If we set up a dog cam, I have to have my parents' dog involved in this too. I feel like it would be very yeah.
Because or what I'll do is I'll take the models. I'll hold your education hostage to me covering drama, and where you have to pay X amount of money to get me to do educational content. We'll figure something out, but it'll be fun. But yeah, I've been looking at this and like, I just went through our video catalog the other day. I'm like, 90% of these is going to be demonetized just because we said things like genocide. So
yeah, that's a problematic thing to talk about, an actual aspect of history that one of us is a specialist in.
And here's the thing, I want to talk about those things frankly and openly and honestly, but it's going to be hard to do.
Does just figure it out. Saying the G word get your
basically if you start demonetized? If you start covering stuff that advertisers don't want associated with their brand, they were a lot more stringent about it in COVID, but like it happens. Race issues.
There's quite a few brands associated with genocide. I mean,
yeah, but they don't want you to be directly associated. Like Siemens wants you to know that they built the handset, not that they manufactured Zycom B.
Yeah, but
yeah, there's a lot of fine German products that weren't so fine in the 40s.
Thank you, Charlie. I appreciate it. I appreciate that I'm not the only one going through it.
So yeah, I think that is that. This was a little shorter, kind of introductory.
I can't wait till the Civil War. I mean, or at least leading up to it, the aftermath. That is a part of American history that I do find very.
We're gonna have a lot of fun with Reconstruction. Did the Civil War ever end? Not really.
No. Although there's a quite, like I don't know if it's a D in there was the South. Well, we'll get to that when we discuss it, but there's a lot more people migrating towards the South, towards places like Atlanta now. a lot of more even immigrants going there. So it's kind of maybe a bit of a reversal when you have the deindustrialization of a lot of the Rust Belt cities and sort of a
Yeah.
growing industry in the South.
Well,
Even
that's not surprising, but that
even somewhat of a reversal of the Great Migration that's happening too. More and more African Americans are moving to the South now.
well, yeah. There's a lot. There's we're gonna have interesting chapters in American history for the 2010, 2020, 2030s, for sure.
Yeah,
And what if Altist is not allowed to write any of them?
no, I'm still waiting on the video that we're supposed to review.
We will try to find something. Let's find a time next week and do another What if Altist video just for funsies.
Yeah, we can. I I'm definitely not gonna screw it up again, but
That's
I
the
need to.
other incident.
I know that is an incident, but yeah. What if Altus is he's very, very hard to watch.
I will compile, Charlie, stuff about the CSA. Uh, industrial slavery didn't actually end up happening on the scale they wanted it to, but we can talk about it.
In the South?
Yes. There's a whole bunch of stuff to talk about there when the time comes. Uh, it's amazing to me how often we do not focus at all on what the South did during the Civil War, government-wise. Uh,
That'll be something new for me.
yeah, not for me. They are scary motherfuckers in the Confederacy. All right. I think that's it. I want to thank everybody. Remember, uh, subscribe, like. We're on
Thank
the
you,
road to
everyone.
we're on the road to 500. If you have 99 friends, now's the time to get them involved in Two Guys Talking History. Have a good evening.
Hmm. Stay safe.